This is part two of participating in passionate topics, discussions of passionate topics, um, presented by Francis Benjamin and moderated by Jeff Gramlich. In the first part, we dealt with why people avoid discussing passionate topics, and now we're going to be dealing with what's and talking about what civil discussions actually look like. Part three is yet to come. It's about how to moderate discussions.
Now, our second part of this session is looking at civility in the context of what do civil discussions look like. And within it, we have 7 different things that we're going to talk about, from advancing civility, recognizing varying perspectives, trust, code of conduct, facts versus feelings, collaborative spaces, and how do you deal with disruptive people if they're purposefully trying to disrupt situations. So the first one, if we're looking to advancing civility, this is where we're talking about, what's the difference between civil and uncivil discussions. And when we're looking at civility, when we're looking at discussions and these difficult and passionate topics that are going to be discussed, understand everybody is not going to agree. And that is fine. That is perfectly fine. Civility does not require agreement. What civility is having an interest in what the other person's perspective is. So I have very strong beliefs about what I believe, but I'm very interested in what other people believe and why they believe it, because I feel they're important. And it's having an attitude and perspective that the other individual is more important than this actual issue that we're talking about and discussing. And that's talking about the person's, their dignity, their value. Their people have value, and I value the opinions that people have and what they believe. Even if it doesn't align with mine, I think it's still very important. And part of what it is this last piece that talks about this intellectual humility. And intellectual humility is talking about, I have very strong beliefs of what I believe, but I also recognize that it's possible there's other people, and actually it's not possible, I know there are, other people that have more knowledge or have researched something out and have a better understanding about that specific topic than I do. And so the intellectual humility is approaching the conversations from the standpoint of, yes, I have strong beliefs, but I'm interested in the knowledge that other people have, their perspectives, how they got there, because that can change my belief. I'm not going to say I decide on a belief and then that belief will never change. But it's keeping open that perspective.
Yeah, so I think one of the points that Francis is talking about there, the second line, civility does not require agreement. And if you feel very strongly in your point of view and you have listened carefully to the other points of view, so a civil discussion, as I understand it, and does not require that you sort of cave to whatever somebody else views as right or the correct way. But you should consider that you might be wrong. We're all human. We make mistakes. We learn. We're constantly learning throughout life and trying to figure out the best way. And there is some value in coming to, in many cases, to coming to a decision, move forward. But that does not require that you give up your individual opinion. It just means that you want to be open to different ideas, right?
Yes, that's good. And so within this is next recognizing varying perspectives. Two people can look at the same thing and accurately describe it as 2 different things, like you see in this picture. So engage constructively, in conversations, since differences can exist. There are cultural differences. So this is that recognizing that perspective. We've already talked about the cultural. There's going to be ideological differences. There's going to be, there's some people that because of ideologies that they're going to have certain beliefs. And the thing that I say is very helpful in recognizing that perspective is this concept of, walking in another person's shoes. If you haven't walked in their shoes, you can't really understand all of that's gone on into shaping what they believe, shaping their behaviors. There's no two people have had the same life experiences, and that's part of the reason why we've ended up with different perspectives in that way. And then this last one, this majority minority perspectives, is understand that if you're in a process, and this might be at work, this might be in politics, this might be at home, where there's discussions that go on, at some point in time, a decision has to be made. And within this, the majority gets to make the decision. Now, the important thing is you need to make sure the minority, their voice is heard in the process. But you're going to have these winners and losers in that. And so, but you need to keep that in perspective, that the majority is, at the end of the day, is going to decide, well, this is the direction to go. And so it's very important that in this process, and I'll talk about the process in a bit, but it's very important in this process that the process is one where people feel that the process is done fairly, everybody's had their voice, so that when the majority decision is done, people can follow that decision.
Yeah, and I would say that that the way Francis just described this is in a decision-making setting. Not all discussions of difficult conversations are in decision-making settings. You could just have a dinner party where there are 4 people there and 3 of them agree on one side and the other one has a different opinion. And I think the important thing in a setting, whether it be a decision one or just a dinner conversation, is to say, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. And if I had walked in your shoes and lived in your culture and lived in an area where a certain ideology dominated, I might have that opinion too. And just respect for their perspective. And the same thing goes if there's a decision that, as Francis said, and that's what politics is all about. Sometimes we move forward and there are winners and losers in politics, but then the next time it comes about, you might want to have those people with minority perspectives to be on your side. So you want to develop the respect for that and for their perspective.
Yeah, it's all about not burning bridges in the midst in the process. And so I touched on previously this developing this process of trust. So when you're having these discussions around passionate topics, you want to make sure that it's transparent for the process. That there's not some things that are done with just a couple people and that leaves everybody else out. The process should be one that is transparent. You need to make sure all voices are heard. And within this, if there's people that are dominating the conversation, then the moderator or others should actively work to make sure others are brought into the conversation and have the opportunity for their voice to be heard. If it is a situation where decisions need to be made, then make sure that decision process is communicated ahead of time of this is how we're going to make the decision, and show how it's going to be done in a fair process. And through this whole piece, communicate the process. So if you're going to be a moderator for a difficult, or a passionate topic, communicate the process up front of how you're going to go through this moderation and how you're going to talk about it. Don't surprise people in the midst of the conversation of, well, we're going to handle it this way. But make sure that communication is done up front in order to help people trust the process and trust the discussion.
And I would say not all meetings have moderators. In fact, probably the vast majority of meetings don't have moderators. But that doesn't mean that if you know somebody is being affected by a decision that's happening in that meeting, you are going to get better buy-in from the people that are there if you take a moment to actually ask people that are not speaking up, what is their opinion? Make sure that they have a chance to speak, and they may not want to speak, but it's really important to make sure they have a chance.
Yeah. And as a part of the process, having a code of conduct is very helpful. And really, what a code of conduct is designed is, if you're going into a discussion, the code of conduct helps clearly define what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, as a part of the process, as a part of the conversation. It is one of those that sets boundaries. It removes power struggles, and the way it removes power struggles is if someone says something or does something in a way that is an offensive way. So as opposed to, it might be you don't agree with what they're doing, well, as opposed to it's something where they're actually actively offending or doing something that's improper. If you don't have the code of conduct, what happens is, if you try to call them out, then they're just like, well, it's something that's between the two of us, as opposed to, I actually did something wrong. So it becomes a power struggle between the two people in discussion. If you can't point to, at the beginning, we agreed on this code of conduct of how we were going to participate in this conversation. And so you can point back to it, and it takes the power struggle out between two people. The other thing it does is that it helps, gives individuals an understanding of how they can communicate if there is something that offends them, or they think someone is doing something that in an improper way. The code of conduct would actually help call that out. And then the last piece on here is it provides that a process for those disagreements, as opposed to in the heat, something comes up and the conversation escalates because you're upset and there's disagreement, and then you're trying to, how do we handle the disagreement in the midst of being angry? That's really the hard time to figure out what the process is to handle something if you're in the middle of it.
Yeah, so I wonder if we can provide a link to a code of conduct. Do you think?
We can. So we can do we can do that and provide an example of.
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. The next thing is understand that in the midst of the conversation, there's going to be people that are going to say, relying on facts. There's going to be individuals that rely on analysis of those facts, so the way they take the facts and they analyze them, but they're using perspectives. Two, there's going to be people that are going to say, well, this is how I feel, but don't really have any facts to back that up. Now, it's not that you don't want to have feelings expressed, but you need to understand, when is it feelings and when is it facts? Because the feelings is a perspective that the person has, but you can't just, well, I think that the sky is purple, that's what I feel. You can't just rely on that as a fact type of thing. So that's where in this piece articulate clearly facts versus feelings. So if you're going to bring up something that is a basis, if it is a fact, then you should be able to cite, what is the foundation for this as a fact? Where was this study done, or where was this communicated in that way, as opposed to, well, I feel this is what it is. Because as you move forward in these discussions and trying to come to common agreement, you want to make sure that what you do decide on is grounded in fact. And if there's areas where you're not quite sure of the facts, then that provides opportunity to go back and do some further research in order to bring those back in order to come to the best decision. So within this is just talking about recognizing the difference between anecdotes to actually evidence that is supported by research or law or things like this.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty important to recognize the source of articles in particular. If we get information off the web, typically, it's important to evaluate where the writer is coming from. What kind of an organization do they work for? Is it a lobbying group, or does it have a particular written or unwritten bias that are and so you need to evaluate that source, and it's far more important today than it was when I was young to evaluate those sources. The other one I would point out is, if my neighbor's pet snake gets into my yard, that's a fact. But then to extrapolate that and say pet snakes are a problem in my community is an interpolation that probably, at least where I live, isn't a valid generalization. So we have to be really careful about what the difference between anecdotal, which would be my neighbor's pet snake got out and it came into my yard, as opposed to quantitative data, which is like how many pet snakes got out in the last year or 2 years, and that becomes a much more probably valid measure to be making decisions based upon.
Then as a part of this civility piece, it's important to be creating collaborative spaces. And within that context, that's where I've talked about some of these different things. One is as it relates to technology. If you think about civility as about the relational side, I want to understand individuals, people's perspective. Technology is often designed in order to make processes quicker for people, but in the process, technology oftentimes reduces then the personal contact, the personal touches that happen, so that you text a person rather than you talk face to face. You're losing some of those personal connections and aspects of it. So just understand, if you're going to use technology as a part of the process of these discussions, then understand there's going to be some loss from the face-to-face as it relates to the personal piece.
And I think part of that gets back to what Francis pointed out earlier. Do we have sincere care about the other person? And when you look at Facebook and you see some really wicked disagreements and how people descend into name calling and lots of just negative kinds of discussions of what are very important issues in many cases, but the result is it doesn't move anything forward because they don't really care about the other person. And so you have to be aware that technology can prohibit people from caring about those other people. You're dealing with somebody in another state. You don't really care, so you just call them a name.
So that's where we need to work on creating these inclusive spaces, and that inclusive spaces is where you're aware of the different cultures, the different things that have happened, individuals that are coming to the table, and how can we make sure that we include them in the process in a way that they feel comfortable to be part of the process and involved in the process. When Jeff was talking about the Facebook spiral, this is breaking negative cycles. If you start to see a cycle happen where one person complains and they just kind of build on each other, that's where if you're going to be working to move in a more civil way, you would step in order to work to break that cycle. And part of it is first is identifying it, calling it out, the cycle that's happening, and then helping to direct people to a better way, a more civil way. With the next one on breaking down silos, we all live in silos. And what silos have to do with is, who do we relate to? Who do we trust? Who do we relate to? Who do we work with? If you're within a community, you most likely don't know everybody in your community. You know groups, and it might be a group that is focused around a religious organization, or it might be a group that's around your educational, or might be a group that's around your culture, or it might be a group that's around certain sports. We gravitate to these different groups or these different silos, and it's important to identify what are the silos in my life that I have, and what am I missing because I'm siloed in those groups from the other perspectives, and then how do I work to actively participate and understand those perspectives. And so if you're in a group and there's someone in that group that is a part of a different silo that you really don't relate with, then you should actively try to engage them in order to understand their perspectives before you just assume that their perspectives are a certain way.
Yeah, recognize that there are other silos out there too, and you're not part of them, but you need to try to figure out what their views are in those other silos.
And then the last one is dealing with winners and losers, and that's if there's a decision that's made, understand there's going to be some people that come out on the winning side, and there's going to be some people that may come out on the losing side. Not everybody, not in every decision is everybody the winner. Does everybody agree? There might be some that don't agree, but there might be a process where you have to make a decision to go forward. So within that, just recognize that that's the case, and you need to make sure that the process is one that is trusted, so that the losers will say, the process was done right. I realize I'm not in the majority on this, so I'm going to support what the majority agrees with. Rather than burning a bridge, let's work together, for the better of our community. And when we're talking about passionate topics, oftentimes the reason why they're passionate topics is because the answers are not clear. The answers are not simple, and the answers are something that can be disruptive to certain lifestyles, depending on what answer you go with. And so in that context, there's going to be people that feel they're going to give up things to go with a certain direction. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that the process is a good process, and then also have people understand the value of why it's important that we make this decision and at least move forward in this direction.
So the visual there is pretty important, and I think Francis made the slide, but I suspect, I'm just interpreting from my point of view, that if you, for example, don't deal effectively with the winners and the losers, then the losers won't come back, and you're going to have empty chairs, and you're not going to be able to get any kind of decision that includes their interests, and it represents your society or your company or whatever it is that you're trying to move forward, because it's important to have these people at the table and to hear their points of view, recognizing that sometimes there are winners and losers, but you want to respect all the people at the table or at the circle.
Yes, very good. So within this, as a, participant, you need to be a good listener. You need to spend more time listening to other people than you actually talking. And so this slide is talking about, effective listening, the results of being a good listener, the 4 B's of being a good listener. And if I just focus on the 4 B's, you can see the rest of the stuff in the slides, but, be present. You turn off your cell phone. You actually engage and listen to the speaker. Be open, be engaged and involved in the process, and be willing to share openly, and understand that this part about being open, you're not the only one that has probably gone through this experience or has this concern. And there may be others in the room that don't know how to articulate it or how to share it. And so for you to be open about what's happening from your perspective, it can help them also be open to and be more involved in the conversation. The 3rd B, be more interested than interesting. So in other words, focus on the other people, be interested about the others and what they're saying and what they're thinking, as a part of it, and to be a mirror. What that has to do with about reflecting. If someone makes a statement and you're not quite sure, then reflect back. This is what I heard you say. Is that correct? So don't just
that validates their opinion right off the point. Yeah. It just says your opinion is important.
Yeah. Right, and you're trying to make sure you get it right because they're important.
And the benefits over there on the left of being a good listener, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, how to do that, are you're going to get better high quality information from people. They're going to share. If you're a good listener, they're going to share honestly, and they're going to invest in the conversation. They are going to trust that you really do care about them. It'll reduce the conflict because you're actually trying to understand where they're coming from and what motivates them. And at the end, when you make a decision, you're going to get more buy-in, better commitment to reaching the goal, because ultimately you tend to, if there's a decision at hand, you want everybody to get in there together and get behind it, because if you're only working with 50% of the people, your organization is not going to move forward very well.
And continuing on, so what are the traits? And we got 12 of them here, and Jeff and I can kind of go back and forth. So the first trait, listen without distractions, and that's where turn your cell phone off, put away other work or other classwork, and just focus on the conversation that's there.
And the second one is you want to keep your eyes on the speaker, and if you're and that doesn't matter whether you're in a Zoom conversation or you're in person, but keep your eyes on them. And in Zoom, you have this ability to put all of the participants up there on the screen and see them, and you can ask questions. You can ask them what is your opinion about this? So you can keep your eyes on them and see if they're paying attention.
and concentrate on what's being said. And what that has to do with is so often that in the conversation, while the person is speaking, we're trying to formulate what we're going to say next. And we actually stop listening to the person because we're focused on coming up on how we're going to say our argument or how we're going to say. Make sure that you focus on what is being said and actually listen to what they're saying.
And that falls very similar to don't prejudge the message. Sometimes we prejudge a message and then we turn it off. We know what they're going to say. And so we just turn it off. And we don't want to do that because they very well, if they've been a good listener, they might have a different view now.
And avoid interrupting. That's each person should have the opportunity to share what they feel, and the interruptions. What that does is it discounts their value. You need to give them, show them that they're important and listen to without interrupting.
At the same time, you can enhance the conversation by asking questions about, like, open-ended questions, what and how questions of the other person, but you don't want to interject and just change and change the topic away from what they're trying to say. And
then summarize. If someone's talking about something and it's a little complex, take time and summarize them. Let me make sure I got this right. I believe this is what you're saying, correct?
Right. And these are difficult conversations and so we have to recognize, as Francis pointed out earlier, that our own emotion and the emotions of the other people in the room are affecting this, and emotions drive much the way we live. We just need to recognize and react to those emotions in a civil way.
And this use positive body language. What this is talking about is, if someone's talking and there's an agreement, nod your head, let them know that you agree with what they're saying. Make sure you keep eye contact with them. Look at them. Don't be distracted. Around the room. For your body, lean into the conversation as opposed to pulling back from the conversation. If you lean into the conversation, you communicate that there's an interest, but you will actually listen better if you lean in than not. So that's where, be positive in your body language during the conversations.
Listen for what's not being said, especially if there's groups that are not speaking. For example, if it's just a couple of white guys like Francis and me, and we're in there in a room with women or with different races, and they're not speaking. I'm trying to figure out why. Why are particular people, and that's in a cultural setting, but why are particular people, given their background or their experiences, not speaking up?
And then allow silence when appropriate. So if you ask a question and nobody answers, don't immediately move on to something else. But let the pause happen, because it may be that someone wants to say something, but they're not quite sure how to say it, and they need a little bit of time in order to figure out, okay, how am I going to articulate this? How am I going to communicate this? But silence is okay. Culturally, for us in the U.S., we don't like silence. We want to fill that. We want to fill that time. But the silence is okay. Those pregnant pauses are okay, to just pause and let there be a little bit of silence while people ruminate on something.
Right. And it's important to create an atmosphere for unhurried conversation, while at the same time trying to keep that conversation focused on the topic at hand. Yeah, and so that's a fine line, especially if you're a moderator. You want to, it's okay to have an easy going, where relaxed kind of conversation, but you have to try to keep it on topic.
And then this next one is dealing with disruptive people. There may be individuals that are in the session that they purposely are being disruptive. So as opposed to someone, well, they say something and they offend or they disrupt, but they really didn't mean to. These are individuals that use it as a strategy. And this first one is with strategic incivility. What strategic incivility what that recognizes are individuals that if they're in a conversation and they don't like the direction that the conversation is going, they will then act out. They will yell, they will scream, they might, in a way that makes other people in the room uncomfortable. And so then the other people in the room, they kind of pull back and they placate. And it's like, okay, what can I do in order to calm you down? And what it's doing is they're using incivility in order to get their way. And then what happens out of it is, if you remember back when we talked about the different things that happen, the term fawn, then people in the group, they're going to, the next time there's a difficult conversation that comes up with that person in the room, they're going to fawn in order to try to avoid that person's outbursts happening again. So that's and so that's the strategy. So for that strategic incivility, you might also run into individuals where, and for the strategy for the strategic incivility, that's where the code of conduct is very important, because the code of conduct, you're able to say, no, that how you just acted is inappropriate based on the code of conduct, not because I feel it's inappropriate, but because the code of conduct we agreed on ahead of time. The next one, this line in the sand, you're going to run into some people where they're going to draw a line in the sand and they're not going to cross that line. And in that case, what they've done is they've just said the issue now is more important than who you are, than me caring about your dignity, your perspective in that, and wanting to understand why you believe why the other person believes what they believe. So you're going to have some of those, and that's where, whether as a group or as a moderator, you need to reiterate, we need to allow everybody to be able to, we want to make sure everybody's voice is heard within it. The next, this contempt. Some people might, you might have a situation where there's just contempt for another person, where I just hate you. I don't like you. And there's this just contempt for the person. Honestly, that's a very difficult one to deal with in the situation, because it's not the difficult topic that is the issue in the room, is the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is, I hate this other person. And it's almost like you need to move from your your passionate topic into, why do you hate this person, and work that out to come back. Now, that's, in some situations you're able to do that. In other situations, you might have to find another meeting time in order to just help those two deal one-on-one. And then this last one is this preference for dysfunction. And what that has to do with is, there may be some individuals that, if you are in a situation where you're actually trying to come to a solution or a decision, and then that decision is going to be implemented, they may not want any decision implemented. So their strategy is, how do I disrupt the meeting in such a way that no decision is made, so that there's nothing that changes from how it's currently set up in the status quo. And that's this, where they are acting out, or they're purposely trying to create conflict or disruption, because it meets their goal of your group not coming to a conclusion. And then once again, that's where you go back to that, the code of conduct, making people, what is your process? Is a process of in order to work in a way in order to get to a decision that people will trust. Those are the ways that you're going to need to work with these individuals. But just to be aware, you could run into these type of individuals in the midst of the course of your life.
Yeah, there's typically a group that likes the status quo, and that brings us back to what Francis talked about earlier, the idea of a code of conduct and a clear, transparent process for how it's going to move forward. And then if you follow the process, there may be winners and losers, but hopefully the losers will respect the outcome.
Very much so. And so that wraps up our second part of this, which was on the civility and civil discussions.